I'm Chris Wallace. The push for tax reform heats up as Republicans face growing political pressure to produce.
This is about actually improving people's lives and making a positive difference.
If they think that this is the bill that they must pass in order to stay in power, they have it all wrong.
We'll discuss what's in the House and Senate plans and whether Republicans have the votes with a point man on tax reform, Republican Chairman Kevin Brady. Then, after sweeping election losses this week, the GOP is now dealing with growing calls for Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore to step aside.
These attacks involve a minor. They're completely false and untrue.
We'll discuss what it means for the special election with Chris Van Hollen, head of the Senate Democrats' campaign arm. Plus, President Trump on the world stage, taking his America First message abroad.
We are not going to let the United States be taken advantage of anymore.
We'll ask our Sunday panel about the president's trip to Asia and his latest comments about alleged Russian interference in the 2016 election. And our Power Player of the Week, a new high-tech museum for the good book.
The Bible is, love it or hate it, it's just one of the great reads of all time.
All right now on Fox News Sunday. And hello again from Fox News in Washington. We begin with breaking news. President Trump dealing with a new controversy when he seemed to suggest, after meeting with Vladimir Putin, he believes Putin's denial of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. White House correspondent Kevin Corke reports from the Philippines.
As to whether I believe it or not, I'm with our agencies, especially as currently constituted with their leadership. I believe in our intel agencies, our intelligence agencies.
In attempting to clear up confusion over whether he accepted Russian President Vladimir Putin's denials of meddling in the U.S. election last year, President Trump, to the surprise of many, repeated his belief Saturday that Putin was sincerely convinced that there was no meddling.
I think it was very obvious to everybody. I believe that President Putin really feels, and he feels strongly, that he did not meddle in our election. What he believes is what he believes.
However, U.S. intelligence agencies have long since concluded that there was meddling. The president's recalibrated explanation threatened to overshadow his final stop on this five-country Asia tour and followed a firestorm of criticism back home. There's nothing America First about taking the word of a KGB colonel over that of the American intelligence community, said Arizona Senator John McCain in a statement. Trump said he wasn't interested in arguing over meddling and instead wanted to get Russia to work with the U.S. on problems like North Korea, Syria, and Ukraine. The president taking to Twitter to slam his critics, writing, "When will all the haters and fools out there realize that having a good relationship with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing?" In another tweet, the president actually took a swipe, Chris, at the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who has repeatedly called the 71-year-old commander-in-chief old. The president tweeting, "Why would Kim Jong-un insult me by calling me old when I would never call him short and fat?" The president added that he'd been working hard to become his friend and, despite the dust-up, was holding out hope that that could still happen. Good luck with that. Chris?
Kevin Corke, we're traveling with the president in the Philippines. Kevin, thank you. Now to the push by Republicans to pass tax reform. Both chambers take up separate proposals this week that have big differences. While the House appears on track to pass its version, the process is just beginning in the Senate. The goal is to get on the same page and send a compromise to the president by Christmas. Joining me now from Texas, Congressman Kevin Brady, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee that passed its tax plan this week. Chairman, the biggest difference between the House and the Senate tax plan seems to be over the question of deducting state and local taxes. Let's drill down on this. Your bill lets people deduct $10,000 in property taxes on their federal returns. The Senate plan kills all deductions for state and local taxes. And Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer says that if they eliminate those state and local taxes, it could cost Republicans the House in 2018. Here he is.
I say to every one of my Republican colleagues in the House who come from a suburban district, this bill could be your political doom.
Chairman, you've got more than 24 Republican congressmen from high-tax states. Can you guarantee them, because they are threatening to vote against an elimination of all the state and local tax deductions, can you guarantee them that the final bill they vote on will not include the total elimination in the Senate plan?
Yeah, well, I can, and here's why. Because we want people to keep more of what they earn, regardless of whether wherever they live, including in these high-tax states. That's why we keep the home mortgage deduction. We keep the charitable deduction. We restore $10,000 of the property tax deduction, which is twice the national average. But we didn't stop there for these states. So the way we set the income brackets, we've created this new family tax credit that is eligible for families up to $230,000 of income, and we restore the state and local property tax deduction.
I understand that.
The combination of all of these gets the job done for these families.
But, Chairman, how can you guarantee House members from blue states that the Senate plan, the total elimination, will not be in the final bill?
Look, I'm convinced that this is where we're going to end up because it's important, again, as I told you, Chris, to make sure people keep more of what they earn, even in these high-tax states. And so what we're working toward, what we've worked so carefully with our lawmakers from New York and California and New Jersey, is to make sure we deliver this relief, and I'm committed to it.
So are you saying then that the House will not accept a total elimination, that just won't fly even if the Senate passes it?
That's what I'm saying.
Good, thank you. I want to go through some other big differences between the House and Senate plans. They're technical, but they're important, as you well know, to every individual taxpayer. For wealthy people and businesses, your bill, the House Republican bill, repeals the estate tax over 6 years and cuts the corporate rate to 20% right away. The Senate plan delays that corporate rate cut a year and does not repeal the estate tax ever. But with the money that the Senate plan saves, while you eliminate the deductions for medical expenses and student loans, the Senate would allow people to keep taking those deductions. My question is, isn't the Senate plan better for the middle-class taxpayer than your plan is?
Yeah, I don't believe so, but here's the point. I know that everyone's stressing the differences. There are some, but there's far more common ground. And in this regard, look, on the death tax, I'm just convinced this is the #1 reason our family-owned farms and businesses aren't passed down to the next generation. Having Washington swoop in and take almost half of what you've earned over your lifetime over a certain amount is just wrong, and getting rid of it creates 140,000 new American jobs because our local businesses aren't hindered by it. And so I'm convinced it needs to go. I also believe we delivered dramatic middle-class tax relief all up and down that area, especially for suburbs and rural communities that I represent.
But, Chairman Brady, I want to show you two independent analyses that seem to contradict what you just said. The New York Times says under your plan, about 1/3 of middle-class families will get a tax increase, not a tax cut, next year. And the bipartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, this is bipartisan, as I say, it says that 8.3% of all taxpayers will get a tax increase in 2019. In both cases, Chairman Brady, these analyses say that middle-class families under your plan, some of them, millions of them, will get a tax increase, not a tax cut.
So here is where I strongly disagree. I believe there's tax relief all up and down the income level for families, regardless of what they earn. And Joint Committee on Taxation confirmed every income bracket sees a tax relief. And as for the New York Times analysis, look, they're describing an America that doesn't exist, one where the economy never grows and one where your paycheck stays stagnant no matter what happens. We know that's not the real world, both from the John F. Kennedy proposed tax cuts and from the Reagan tax cuts as well. When you get the tax code right, where our local businesses can compete and win anywhere in the world, when Washington takes less of what you earn, the economy does grow and paychecks do grow. And so I strongly disagree with analysis like the New York Times.
But would you agree, and you're exactly right, that in all of these analyses, if you take each tax bracket, there is a net tax cut, but would you agree that there are going to be a sizable number of middle-class families, families that, for instance, now get the state and local tax deduction, families that have big medical expenses they can deduct, families that are deducting the interest for their student loans, that there are a lot of those families that could actually be losers in this bill?
See, I don't, Chris, and here's why. Look, we are both taxing less. We are eliminating a lot of these deductions so we can lower the tax rates for every American. But we're not just stopping there. We're talking about an economy that grows paychecks in a way we haven't seen for really almost 2 decades, if you think about it. And that's what helps families the most. They're keeping more of what they earn. Their paychecks are finally growing. This economy's finally moving again. So, I firmly believe Americans are far better off under tax reform than they ever would sticking with this old, messed up, outdated tax code.
I want to turn to a different aspect of this, sir. I talked with a number of top financial analysts this week. None of them said that having a tax cut, a lot of them supported the idea of a tax cut, but none of them said that having a tax cut that will add $1.5 trillion to the national debt, which is what your plan does, that's good for the economy.
Well, I have to tell you what, I disagree here. So during the Obama administration, they would add $1.5 trillion of deficit every year. That was to grow Washington. We're talking about the same amount spread out over a decade to grow the economy and grow jobs. This is a good investment. And in fact, if we just grow the economy slightly over the last decade's slow growth, you recoup the $1 trillion easily. And if we really get this economy moving, you recoup all of it plus more. So I will tell you the surest way to guarantee more deficits and more debt is just stick with the current tax code, stick with the current economy. I guarantee it won't be a good ending. It's time to change and challenge the status quo in this tax code.
All right, let's talk about the prospects for all of this, because that's the bottom line. President Trump called into a meeting of Senate Democrats this week, and he reportedly said this. He told them about the Senate plan. You're going to like it, the Senate plan, a whole lot more than the House plan. I don't have to remind you, because you lived through it, that after the House passed Obamacare repeal and replace, the president later said that he thought the plan was a little bit mean. Aren't you asking some of your members to take what's a tough political vote when the president may, in the end, after they vote that and you pass it, walk away from the House plan and support the Senate plan?
So I don't believe he will, and here's why. His regular conversations with me tell me he likes the direction we're going in a big way. We're riding toward that framework that the President, the House, and Senate came together on earlier this fall. He also likes the fact not only are we delivering middle-class tax relief, but the first time our local businesses are going to be able to compete and win anywhere in the world, and when they win, we'll no longer tax them to bring their earnings back home to be reinvested in the United States of America. So I'll just tell you, I think we're making significant changes in this tax code in a real positive way, and this is what the president backs.
So how do you explain? What do you make of the president saying to Senate Democrats, I think you'll like the Senate plan a lot more?
Well, I know that's the Senate Democrats' description of the call. All I can tell you is my conversations by telephone with the president are extremely positive. And so the House is going to take a major step, as it did this week at Ways and Means Committee, for the first time in 31 years to fix this messed up, broken tax code. And from there, it goes to the Senate. I have no doubt we're going to find common ground and work out the differences.
All right, and let's get to the bottom line. Will the House pass your tax plan, or the tax plan, by Thanksgiving, as now scheduled, which is just 11 days away?
I believe it will. I feel there's strong support for this. We continue to make improvements at every step in the way, but I'll tell you what, our Republicans in the House know that it is time to deliver on this economy and grow these paychecks. By getting rid of this current tax code. That's exactly what we're going to do. And by the way, the American people, they're starved. They are starved for a new tax code, one that's so simple and fair. Most Americans will be able to file using a simple postcard-style system where they're eager for that simplicity and that fairness.
Again, finally, on that deadline, can you say that with 100% certainty you'll pass it before Thanksgiving?
Look, that's our goal, and that's what we're on schedule to do. And at the end of the day, what I want to do is deliver this to the President's desk by the end of the year, not for Republicans, but for the American people.
Chairman Brady, thank you, and we will track progress on tax reform in the House this next week.
Thank you, Chris.
Up next, disturbing allegations against Roy Moore, the Republican Senate candidate in Alabama, in the wake of Democratic victories across the country on Election Day. We'll talk with Senator Chris Van Hollen, head of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, about his party's prospects to take back control of both the House and Senate in 2018. This week, allegations of sexual misconduct that date back decades surfaced against Alabama Senate candidate Judge Roy Moore. Top Republicans took back endorsements and cut off fundraising efforts for Moore. Alabama's special election is on December 12th, and with the GOP now holding a slim two-vote majority in the Senate, what happens in Alabama could determine the fate of tax reform and the rest of the Trump agenda. Joining us now, Senator Chris Van Hollen, chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. Congressman, Roy Moore has flatly denied ever having any improper relationship with teenagers. Sean Hannity asked him about some of the specifics on Friday. Here it is.
Do you remember dating girls that young at that time?
Not generally, no.
But you don't specifically remember having any girlfriend that was in her late teens even at that time?
No, I don't remember that, and I don't remember ever dating any girl without the permission of her mother.
Senator, your reaction?
Well, Chris, I think Roy Moore is unfit for office, but this is going to be a decision, obviously, for the people of Alabama. And the good news for the people of Alabama is they have a clear alternative in Doug Jones, who grew up in Alabama. He became a prosecutor. He's focused on jobs. He's focused on increasing people's wages. He's focused on the things people in Alabama care about, and he's running a good campaign. So I'm not going to get into all these details because it's the people of Alabama who are going to decide. But those who have, people like Senator Bill Cassidy, obviously withdrew their endorsements. So let's let the people of Alabama decide. But the good news, as I said, is they have a great alternative in Doug Jones.
Wait, let me ask you, what do you think now? The polls have tightened considerably. What do you think are the chances that the Democratic candidate, Doug Jones, will actually win in the deep red state of Alabama? And what about the notion that is being discussed of, with these new revelations, the governor of Alabama postponing, delaying the special election next month?
Well, Chris, Doug Jones, again, is talking about all the issues that are important to people there in the state of Alabama. His focus has been on economic issues, kitchen table issues. So, look, we all know that Alabama is a very tough state politically for Democrats, but this is a special situation where we have a great candidate. On the other hand, you have a very, very flawed candidate in Roy Moore, which is why many people are calling upon him to step down. But I'm going to leave this to the people of Alabama. This is their decision. They're getting the facts now, and they need to make a decision based on the records of these two candidates.
One more question on this subject. From the president to Senate Republican leaders, a number of them are saying that Moore should step down if the allegations are proven. Here is fellow Alabama Senator Richard Shelby.
It's a devastating, nasty story. If the revelations, if that's true, I don't believe there'd be any place for him in the U.S. Senate.
Is that reasonable? I understand I don't want you or expect you to get into the specific allegations, but is that reasonable when you have allegations that date back, in some cases, almost 40 years? Let's see some proof.
Well, again, people like Senator Bill Cassidy looked at the facts, and we know what conclusion he drew. My view, Chris, is that Roy Moore was really unfit for the Senate even before these recent revelations. For example, there's ample evidence. This was also reported in the Washington Post, very detailed reporting, that he essentially cheated a charity that he was involved in for his personal private gain. So, again, there are lots of facts out there about these issues, and the people of Alabama will make up their minds. But I hope they will look at the facts because you've got a candidate in Doug Jones who has been sticking to the issues that people really care about, issues about health care, issues about tax policy that's going to impact the people of Alabama, educating the children in Alabama. Those are going to be the important issues, and I think Doug Jones has shown that he's a candidate who has a record that can actually help Alabama, but that's up to the state to decide.
Understood. Let's talk about this question of allegations, and allegations particularly of sexual misconduct, which often can't be proven one way or another. It's going to end up being a he said, she said. Let's take the case of Bill Clinton, for instance. As you well know, there were allegations of sexual misconduct, even rape, against Bill Clinton. Democrats nominated him, elected him president. There was strong indication. Bill Clinton basically admitted that he had lied to the country about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, and yet Democrats fought his impeachment. Is there a double standard here?
Chris, I don't think there's any double standard here. You're also talking, in this case, as you know, about allegations of child sexual abuse. We know what the allegations are. The people of Alabama will have to look at the facts, search their conscience, and make a decision. So I think that's always the case when you have revelations like this. But the bottom line is that Doug Jones is focusing on issues like health care and the fact that you saw a Republican Congress try to take away people's access to affordable health care. And he's talking about having a tax code that actually works for working people instead of a giveaway to big corporations and the super rich.
As long as we're, and this is, I promise, my final question in this regard, Senator, as long as we're talking about allegations, a jury in New Jersey is right now considering not allegations but charges of political corruption against Democratic Senator Bob Menendez. If that jury convicts him, not allegations, but a conviction, should he step down?
Chris, we're going to leave this decision to the jury, and I'm not going to get ahead of the game. People on the jury will look at the facts, just like people in Alabama will have to look at the facts, and they'll have to render a decision. And I'm not going to speculate about what the outcome of that jury decision will be.
You, as we pointed out, are the chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. Democrats had a very big night Tuesday, sweeping elections, the governor's race in New Jersey, the governor's race in Virginia, down ballot as well. Here was Virginia's new governor-elect, Ralph Northam.
Virginia has told us to end the divisiveness, that we will not condone hatred and bigotry, and to end the politics that have torn this country apart.
Senator, is there a national message in the vote this week?
There's certainly a message in the fact that you had a huge grassroots turnout in these elections. And it's not just that the Democratic won the candidate in Virginia, the governor's race, but the size of that margin and the scope of the victories, and victories across the country, including in Georgia, New Hampshire, Washington State, even some mayoral races in my state of Maryland. So it's that scope that showed really huge motivation and turnout. The question, of course, is whether that will be sustained. And I can tell you, a lot of people were really upset that Donald Trump and Republicans tried to take away their access to affordable health care. And they're going to be really mad if they try and pass this huge giveaway to big corporations that's going to be paid for by millions of middle-class families. So those are the kinds of things that are going to keep people motivated to come out.
Well, let's talk in the time we have left about the tax plan, and let's talk first of all about the middle class. The vast majority of low and middle income Americans do not itemize their deductions. Doesn't doubling the standard deduction, doesn't that benefit? I mean, I certainly pointed out, as you heard me with Chairman Brady, that there are some people who are going to be hurt, but doesn't doubling the deduction dramatically help most low and middle income voters?
As you know, Chris, while they doubled the standard deduction, they also took away, with the other hand, the ability of people to take their personal exemptions for themselves and dependents. And when you wash that all out, the reality is that many families, many middle-class families, are going to end up paying more, especially when you take away people's ability to deduct their state and local taxes. And the folks in the suburbs are going to get clobbered. As you mentioned in your earlier segment, the New York Times analysis, and they used, I believe, software from a more conservative group, concluded that almost half of middle-class Americans would actually be paying more. And they've looked at the Senate bill and concluded about a third of middle-class taxpayers would be paying more under the Senate bill. So that's why Paul Ryan, Speaker Ryan, and Mitch McConnell this week both had to walk back their statements where they had earlier said that there wasn't going to be any impact on middle-class taxpayers. In fact, millions and millions of middle-class taxpayers are going to pay more so big corporations can pay less. And folks in the suburbs are going to be particularly clobbered.
All right, let me ask you, I got one last question, and it has to do with this issue of corporations. And you know, the Democratic line, and I've heard it from you, I've heard it from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, this is a giveaway to big corporations. But you certainly have to agree that the U.S. corporate tax rate, which is 35%, which is, no question about it, the highest in the world, what's wrong with lowering it to 20%, which puts it in line with other industrialized nations in the world? What's wrong with making us more competitive? Won't that boost those corporations, boost growth, boost wages, boost jobs?
So a couple things, Chris. First, you know that the effective U.S. corporate tax rate is much lower. Some people put it around 20% because corporations take a lot of these deductions. But we could do corporate tax reform, but we should do it in a way that doesn't boost the national debt by $1.5 trillion and still ask millions of middle-class taxpayers to pay for it. Do you know about a third of stockholders are foreigners, right? So you're now asking middle-class taxpayers to finance tax relief for people who are foreign stockholders. Corporations in America are making record profits. Wages are pretty flat. This notion that somehow we got to give another big tax break to corporations and it's going to trickle down and lift wages is disproven by what we're seeing right now. And in fact, as you know, the CEOs from around the country have been reporting that they're going to use that extra money for stock buybacks in their shareholders. So at the end of the day, this is a proposal where middle-class taxpayers in suburbs and other places around the country are going to be paying for the tax cuts of big corporations. That's just not right.
Senator Van Hollen, thank you. Thanks for your time this week, and always good to talk with you, sir.
Good to be with you.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss the key takeaways from the Democrats' big wins on Tuesday night. Plus, what would you like to ask the panel about Judge Roy Moore? What should the Republican Party do? Just go to Facebook or Twitter at Fox News Sunday. We may use your question on the air.
Investigated more than any other person in this country. To think that grown women would wait 40 years to come right before an election to bring charges is absolutely unbelievable.
GOP Senate candidate Judge Roy Moore fighting back against allegations of sexual misconduct and making it clear he has no intention of dropping out of the special election in Alabama next month. And it's time now for our Sunday group, the head of Heritage Action for America, Michael Needham, Charles Lane of the Washington Post, Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, and former National Security Council staffer Jillian Turner. Well, Michael, the Republican Senate Campaign Committee has withdrawn from joint fundraising with Roy Moore, and the establishment camp of the GOP is saying this is what happens when you have Steve Bannon looking for challengers to Republican incumbents. Your reaction?
Well, I think that would be rewriting history. I mean, I think what happened in the Alabama Senate primary was most conservatives were supporting Mo Brooks down there. He's somebody who did very well on the Heritage Action scorecard, on the Club for Growth scorecard. Laura Ingraham,
we don't
Sean
need to
Hannity,
go back
Mark
to Mo
Levin.
Brooks. Let's talk about Roy Moore.
Well, but I think it gets to something about the party. If the party is going to say we are going to always spend millions of dollars trying to defeat the legitimate conservative, the policy-focused conservative, because we want the person who will be most loyal to the current Senate leadership. And the Senate Leadership Fund, Mitch McConnell's super PAC, spent millions of dollars taking Mo Brooks out because they thought that Luther Strange had a better chance of beating Roy Moore.
Should Roy Moore step down?
I think that if these allegations are true, Roy Moore should step down. I think that even more.
If you say these allegations are true, I mean, in the
Washington Post
we're never
article,
have proof.
Sure, the Washington Post article is pretty compelling. When Roy Moore tells Sean Hannity did a very hard-hitting interview on Friday that he generally did not date teenagers when he was in his 1930s. I think that Roy Moore is going to need to provide people more confidence that this isn't true because the evidence is pretty overwhelming. And if not, frankly, I think he's going to have trouble being seated in the Senate, even if he does win the election.
And he also said as part of his defense that he never asked girls out without asking permission from their mother, which is a first, I have to say. Julie,
infuriating. That's why I was shaking my head.
No, go ahead.
I mean, that idea is infuriating, that somehow, had he asked the parents if he could go out with a 14-year-old and they had said yes, it would have been perfectly acceptable. I found that idea repugnant.
Julie, on the record, President Trump is taking the position of most officials that if it's proven, then Moore should step down. Behind the scenes, what does the political team at the White House want to see?
Well, both the political team at the White House and Republicans on the Hill are kind of at a loss right now because they don't have a good option. Absentee ballots have been printed. Roy Moore is going to be on the ballot no matter what. Even if he does drop out, that means he's going to get votes. So there are a couple options being discussed right now. One, could you get a credible write-in candidate? That's a tricky thing for them to do, though, because it could potentially split the Republican votes. It could lead Doug Jones, the Democrat, to sneak through if you do that. There's been some discussion about the governor pushing off the election. No one seems to think that that's a great idea. It's generally not advised that you have governors stepping in to push back elections because the political situation for their party isn't good. The repercussions of that could be pretty difficult. And then to Michael's point, the third option being discussed is if Roy Moore does get through, should the Senate seat him? Again, it's a terrible option for Republicans. If this is the candidate who Alabama voters say they want, in spite of these allegations, and in spite of everything else controversial that Roy Moore has done over the years, is it up to the Republican leadership here to say, no, we don't want him? So everyone I've talked to over the last couple of days in the Republican Party at the White House on this is really at a loss. They don't see a good way out on this.
You talk about a Republican grassroots firestorm. You start not seating duly elected members. That would create
the precedent for two of these options: one, pushing off the election, and two, having Republican leaders decide that they don't want to seat somebody who was elected. It's really dangerous no matter what party you're talking about here.
We ask you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Facebook from Michael P. Mulhall. Has the mainstream media coverage been fair, or has Moore been unfairly prosecuted in the court of public opinion without the benefit of careful examination and due process? Chuck, you work for the Washington Post, which broke this story. How do you answer, Michael?
I think the best answer to that is to look at the reaction of a number of Republican senators who are not, who you think of as people who uncritically read the Washington Post. We saw Richard Shelby, Bill Cassidy has been mentioned. They regard the story as, or the information in the story as very credible information. In fact, subsequent to the Post story, other news organizations have gone and asked the women the questions, and they've all repeated what they said. And independent corroboration from people who were told about these allegations simultaneously has come forward. I don't think this is a case of the mainstream media making up a story to get Roy Moore, although I will concede that will be an effective line of defense for Roy Moore among the Republican base in Alabama. And he is.
And so is Steve Bannon.
Yes, and Steve Bannon, going to Julie's point, I think Steve Bannon must be loving this, because what Steve Bannon is about is destroying Mitch McConnell and the quote-unquote Republican establishment. And in a weird way, if Doug Jones wins, that too is a win for Steve Bannon, because it just complicates Mitch McConnell's life and makes things more difficult. This is a guy who compared himself once to Lenin and said he wanted to destroy the state, and in that respect, I'd say he's making a little progress here.
All of this, of course, happens in the wake of the shellacking that Republicans took around the country in last Tuesday's elections. Jillian, in the Fox News voter analysis of the Virginia governor's race. Women, let's put it up on the screen, voted for the Democrat Northam over the Republican Gillespie, women, by a margin of 19 points. If Roy Moore wins the special election next month and is seated in the Senate, won't that just add to Republican problems heading into the 2018 midterm?
I think it will. And when it comes to Moore's conduct, I think whether or not he's ultimately exonerated or proven guilty, the whole episode bodes very poorly for the Republican Party at large, both in terms of their ability to legislate over the coming year and then win elections next year, because the party's effectively now, this past week, arguing amongst itself about allegations of assault of minors. It's a very serious and sort of horrible thing to have to hammer out in a few days before an election. But I think more broadly speaking, looking beyond this special election, I think the party's going to have to come to terms with, is this something that we are willing to prioritize over and above policy? Meaning, are we willing to put our principles aside in order to get to policy solutions that we can all agree on? And that's a question that I think the Republican Party has been grappling with since the 2016 general election. Unfortunately, the assault of women was a theme common during that time also.
All right, we're going to have to take a break here. When we come back, President Trump wrapping up his long trip to Asia. What did he accomplish?